Bibi is coming off a speech to Congress where he was well received. He enjoyed standing ovations from members of Congress, but wasn't especially substantive in terms of the commitments that he was willing to make towards achieving that ceasefire, which on the one hand, he says he's interested in and that Hamas is the #1 barrier to achieving. And on the other hand, his political interests have been served, much like they have Haniya and the leadership of Hamas, continuing this conflict. That said, we've heard that they're very close to a breakthrough, that they're getting closer to an agreement that would look at some kind of a short-term, less than 2 months ceasefire in exchange for the release of women, elderly, and injured that could then be phased into a longer-term ceasefire. So I think the moment is more hopeful than it had been in the last few weeks and months. But let's not hold our breath. It's not done until it's done.
Well, that's absolutely true. And Carmiel, I think we should all remind ourselves of the kind of tenor of the speech that we saw Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu give on the floor of the House chamber yesterday, especially when it comes to what he called his vision for Gaza. This is how he laid it out.
The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
Is that a vision you think the U.S. and President Biden could get behind, Carmiel?
Look, I think this is something that Bibi has been saying multiple times in different ways in different speeches. So we didn't really hear anything new substantively from him yesterday. I think the real question is how to achieve a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. And there's no clear path to that. Only about half of Hamas's soldiers have been taken out, about half of the leadership. They're still very far from getting to the point where the Israelis would be able to, quote, claim victory. And so I think certainly everybody is looking for a Gaza that is not occupied by Israel, that is independent, that is peacefully living alongside Israel. But how we get from point A to point B is where we're going to see lots of tension points between both parties.
How different will Joe Biden's meeting be with Benjamin Netanyahu compared to Kamala Harris's meeting later?
Yeah, it's very interesting that they're having these two meetings separately. Of course, as we kind of get ready for what Bibi sees as kind of this lame duck Biden, Netanyahu is really holding out. He thinks that whatever happens, he's going to get a better deal if Trump is in power, because Trump isn't going to extract any concessions from him. And so I think Netanyahu is going to continue to be reluctant to deliver anything that would seem to bolster Biden or kind of help him. Biden's ambitions for an end to this conflict are very lofty. It's not just, as we discussed, a demilitarized Gaza or a de-radicalized Gaza. He's also looking for a grand deal, something that would bring an agreement between the U.S., Saudi and Israel, and then Israel and the Palestinians to the table. And I think that's going to be a huge focus for him in his final months in office, and he'll have time and space to do it. I think Biden is, as he has said, a Zionist, someone who feels very deeply connected to the state of Israel, but increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu. I think Harris is going to be coming at this from a slightly different place. I think she's a bit more pragmatic. I think she's a little bit less emotionally attached to this conflict, but ultimately she's going to continue to toe the line of this administration as vice president. And the only time that that could change is if she's elected president, and will have to start to lay her own path for her relationship with Israel.
Well, Carmiel, as you talk about the idea that Biden does seem to want some kind of grand deal here, he did allude to that in his speech last night. He didn't just say an end to the war in Gaza, but peace and security in the Middle East. So while he may be most immediately focused on the conflict between Israel and Hamas, I wonder if you still see room for other conflict areas to open up, considering that Netanyahu in that speech yesterday talked about Hezbollah and that Israel will do whatever it can to secure its northern border. He said, and this is a quote, "Those who attack Israel will pay a very heavy price." Is peace and security in the Middle East as a whole, not just in Gaza, a bit of a reach even for this president?
So I think we have to break down the different pieces of what's happening in the region. I think we've already seen, and Netanyahu referred to an Abraham alliance, something that's been worked on behind the scenes a bit to bring together all of the countries who helped Israel respond to the Iranian strikes on Israeli territory. I think on the one hand, there's a huge amount of potential to bring together, Gulf countries, allies with those who are already allied with Israel and those who are interested in allying with Israel, like Saudi Arabia, to respond to the threat posed by Iran and its proxies. So I think we have to differentiate. There's a space for cooperation among allies, and there's also a space for a significant escalation in this war. And we have seen now the Houthis are willing to not just strike Israel. The Houthis have struck Israel 200 times. But this past week was the first time where there was an actual casualty, and that prompted an Israeli response. I think we're going to continue to see that escalation, but we're going to see, on the one hand, bonds that are formed between like-minded allies and escalation with Iran and Iranian-backed proxies.
Benjamin Netanyahu moves on to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump tomorrow, Carmiel. What's the point? What will they discuss?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a number of different things discussed. One is that there's some tension right now between Bibi and Trump. Trump is frustrated that Netanyahu had welcomed Biden and hadn't, played into Trump's claims of election fraud. So there had been some personal friction points where Trump has said disparaging things about Netanyahu. I think once they're kind of past the kissing the ring formalities of it, they're going to talk substance. And what I would expect is that Netanyahu and Trump are going to talk about what a strong U.S.-Israel relationship will look like under a Trump administration, and how Trump will support Netanyahu, irrespective of what is happening domestically or what is happening vis-a-vis the Palestinians.